Welcome to the last lecture. So remember, I want to try and give you something you'll remember in decades. It won't go out of date, so we'll still stay at a relatively abstract level. And I'm going to lean heavily on how science works because, this is this famous German general von Clausewitz, and he would have said, if he was here now, machine learning is the continuation of science by other means. So in a way, that's kind of the theme that I'm relying upon here. And the structure of the lecture is just a bunch of dualities, right? I compare different ways of looking at things, the practice of machine learning in particular, and hopefully that gives some guidance, that long-lasting guidance as to how to avoid some of the problems that we've encountered. We're on Flinders Island at the moment. This is a magical place in the Bass Strait between Tasmania and Australia. So the first duality I'm looking at is from thing to process. So there's literature on science as a process. I mean, it's kind of obvious when people talk about scientific method. So that's a process sort of thing. And machine learning is obviously data processing, right? I mean, we have the data processing theorem, we process our data. And, algorithms, of course, are a process. But what I'm encouraging you to think about is not just, what the computer does, but the entire chain, including the collection of the data, of course, the computation, and then how it ends up being used. The data provenance idea that we met in the last lecture, you can view that as attempting to document the process, right? It's like the chain of evidence, keeping track of where stuff comes from. The process viewpoint is naturally aligned with a non-adherence to stability. So I'll talk about stability and its opposite a little later on. But you can, this is more of a stretch, but you can think of categories as a process. Right? Rather than thinking you've got dog and cat as things, you can think of it as a process, by which I mean the process by which you chose them. Right? Anyway, we'll come back to that later on. Some philosophers, this is David Hull, he wrote this big fat book called Science as a Process, and he claimed that significant scientific insights arise from taking the process perspective. He contrasted Huxley with Darwin. He says, it is as if in observing the world, what Huxley saw was the order of nature, such a fixed bunch of things. Darwin saw its process, right? Evolution is a process. You just see a snapshot now, but you have to imagine the transformation. You look at the founding of the modern science of geology. There's a very famous book by Charles Lyell, The Principles of Geology. It's hard for us to imagine what it's like without. It's hard to imagine a world when you don't have the basic thoughts that you already have. So a couple of hundred years ago, people would look at mountains and all these big geological features, and you think, how on earth could they come about, right? Lyell's insight was that actually these are the result of processes, extremely slow ones, but processes nevertheless. So we can, and I think it's fruitful to think of data as a process. This is probably a rather unusual viewpoint, but I think it's instructive for us to try and think, well, if we normally think the data is a thing, maybe it stretches our minds a little bit if we try to think of it as a process. And I've got some pointers to some literature on this. This is not a novel idea, but it's hardly widespread. So there's a paper data as process, which talks of tracing the transactions and activities that bring data into being. That was the provenance idea I was talking about last week. Christine Borgman talks about the lives and afterlives of data. That's the title of a paper she wrote. Sabina Leonelli, who we've met several times in this course, has made much of this. She talks of data lineages, and there's several interesting papers that I've drawn your attention to there. What counts as scientific data, for example. And a few years ago, I wrote a brief piece that you might find interesting. The title was not mine. The editor chose the title, but it will do. Process and Purpose, Not Thing and Technique, How to Pose Data Science Research Challenges. So I tried to channel the idea of data as a process in reflecting upon people. There was an issue in a journal where some people had posed, here are some big questions about data science. I tried to look at it in a different way. Anyway, I think some of you will find these resources interesting. So another duality is stability and its opposite, which is lability. You might not have heard that word so much, but labile is simply the opposite of stable. Of course, normally engineers like to build things that are solid, right? You would not normally think that what you want is instability. But when we think about knowledge, we do have to be a little bit careful about prematurely making things stable. So Shane Perelman, who we've met several times before, and we will encounter him again later in the lecture, says, a claim that the facts, once established, can be considered as a definitive and permanent acquisition amounts to an assumption that no progress, theoretical or experimental, will modify any of their constituent elements or even the way in which they have been stated. So that's a lot of words to say, don't presume you've got the final answer, right? You always want to allow the possibility that your reasoning could be revised. Of course, you try at any given moment to get the best possible answer, but you just need some humility to suppose that you might not. This crazy guy, I love this photo of him, Paul Feyerabend, says analogously that you do not work with stable concepts. Do not be seduced into thinking that you have at last found the correct description of the facts. So be open to changing your mind. And there's a couple of references I've put down at the bottom there, which makes this far more concrete. Looking at the last one in particular, data science in times of pandemic, is looking at with the COVID pandemic, there was an awful lot of data analytic work done, and people have managed to go and reflect on how well that worked. You recall in an earlier lecture, I talked about the problems of assuming that, a paper in the 1940s that talked about the size of aerosols that stayed in the air was somehow correct, and it caused, goodness knows how many deaths because the WHO relied upon that. So this is another take on that, on something that's quite topical. So the point is, Feyerabend's an abstract philosopher, but these concepts really do matter in the actual practice of machine learning. Another interesting duality to think about is going forwards and backwards. So this is really nothing to do with machine learning, but it's a cool picture. Who's seen this picture before? Right, so there's an interesting bit of history about, who's it actually a picture of, right? So if you just do a crude Google search, you'll learn that it's Rosie the Riveter. That's the name given to her, and this is the person who it was based upon. Anyway, there's when people go and write history, like if you're a historian, you sort of write, these are the facts, this is what happened, and it kind of becomes solid. But sometimes they get it wrong, and this paper has nothing to do with machine learning at all, right? Rosie's Secret Identity, or How to Debunk a Woozle by Walking Backward Through the Forest of Visual Rhetoric. The point is, they had to backtrack a really long way, right? They had this thing, they thought, I'm not so sure about it, they backtrack, and only when you go a long way back to some original source, they managed to find the original photograph and turned it over, and then they saw the person's name, so they could undo it. So, it's kind of, for me, it's kind of weird that someone can write an entire paper, on this, but I read it nevertheless. It's a fascinating detective story. And, so that's a kind of a concrete, funny example, but, serious historians, so Hayden White wrote a book called Meta History. So he's an eminent historian, and he's reflecting upon the practice of writing history, right? So you think of what writing history is like, it's like doing data science. You're observing these facts, you're building a story. for historians, the story side of it is a lot more obvious, right? Because the output is books and, this happened because, this politician wanted to achieve such and such. But the reason I'm talking about this is because I think there is an element of that when we use machine learning to do stuff in the world, right? Once we want to go and say the way to reduce unemployment is to, optimize the allocation of the social welfare benefits, right? We're telling a story, right, which may or may not be true. The willingness to look backward it can be difficult to do because it's very hard. Once you've made up your mind about something, you tend to embrace it and you'll try and justify it. So this is William Bartley, and he we may have met him earlier in the course, but he criticizes the idea. It's kind of across all of our culture that our approach to knowledge is justificatory, right? We don't want to once we've got some tentative knowledge, we say this is the case, and we will now argue for it. We try to justify our position. Right? Once psychologically you get into that frame of mind, it's very hard to let go. Right? You've started to own your position. And he's making the point here that the way you tend to think about knowledge acquisition is in this forward direction. Right? These classical theories of induction. I take the measurements, I build the model, I draw the conclusion. Right? You're only going forwards. The reason you have to go backwards is when you're correcting errors, right? And so not wanting to go backwards, I'm arguing, is kind of like rejecting the idea that you could be wrong, right? It's always onwards and upwards. And, well, he goes on, I won't read all about this, but, if this excites you, you can look him up. But he's making the point that the widespread theory of knowledge that underpins most stories of science tends to be justificatory and authoritarian, right? The facts are an authority and you move everything forward. I made much of black boxes in an earlier lecture. I just want to come back to them briefly. So there's a couple of interesting papers I draw your attention to. One by Jeffrey Bowker. We met him before. He co-authored this book, Classification and Its Consequences. This is quite interesting, biodiversity, data diversity. And he's studying, so he's a sociologist, he's kind of concretely studying the data practices of a certain group of people who worry about biodiversity, keeping track of how many representatives of this species there are. And he observes that the normal practices, which seem, compelling and reasonable and are certainly widespread, they tend to make things irreversible, right? Simply because you don't bake in the possibility of going backwards, right? So that's making this general point that I'm making into something quite concrete. There's another one here to do with privacy, contextual integrity up and down the data food chain. I remind you that if you think, you can think of black boxes in two ways, right? A black box that is sealed shut, or one that you can reopen, and the ability to reopen them is very important. This funny book I mentioned last week, Calling Bullshit: The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World. They say, and I think this is not exactly right, bullshit can act like one of Latour's black boxes, shielding a claim from further investigation. Latour did not say black boxes should be sealed shut and never open. He made a big deal about reversing them. You have to sometimes put something into a box, right? Because you can't keep track of all of the details, right? That's the whole point of abstraction, as long as you can undo it. So that's my point. As long as you have reversible black boxes and the tools to diagnose when to open them up, that's fine, right? But that's tantamount to recognizing your fallibility. Another concrete example that some of you might find interesting, I found this really quite surprising. So there's this open data movement, right? So the idea is that scientists should share their data. And this fellow, I think it was Harry Collins, wrote this article, which I've shared, The Meaning of Data, Open and Closed Evidential Cultures in the Search for Gravitational Waves. So searching for gravitational waves, this is before LIGO. This goes back 20 or 30 years. People have been trying for a long time. So there's a whole community of people who are trying to detect gravitational waves. And he interviewed a stack of scientists and he was asking them, do you share your data? No way. And so he's kind of surprised. Well, why not? And what was interesting, one of his correspondents answered really very explicitly, and I'm going to take this as being representative. I don't know if it is representative, but it's hard to get hard evidence for this. Anyway, what this scientist said was that the reason he didn't want to share his data is he did not want someone else finding a mistake in it. Now, it's kind of obvious what the problem with this attitude is, right? When you're supposed to be, a member of a scientific community. This was not doing things for commercial gain, right? So this is just science for science's sake. Gravitational waves, no one really imagines that this is particularly a useful thing. It's kind of cool to know. But even there, you've got people that are hanging on to stuff so that no one else embarrasses them by pointing out a mistake, right? So that's kind of disappointing. But, very well documented. Okay, I won't mention the bottom one. You can look that up if you want. So more practically, so that's very general principles, but what I'd like you to reflect upon is, if you're doing data analysis, what do you do if you find out that some of the data you used last month were contaminated? So thinking of it as contamination is actually a pretty good metaphor, right? Because it's like it's somehow being poisoned. And now the trouble is, has the contamination spread? Right? Has the disease, has it gone and infected other data? Because the point is, with our machine learning pipelines, we usually not just take data, build model, and then we're done, right? It's all fed together. We ingest multiple different sources of data. So this is one of the reasons why you need to take care. It's even more subtle if you think in terms of your categories. So a couple of lectures ago, I made a big deal about where the categories come from. That's also a choice. What if your categorization was somehow dodgy, right? After a little while, someone pointed out that by categorizing the data in this fashion, like labeling people in this way, you've done violence to this, or you've ignored that, or you've caused this harm. Well, what are you going to do, right? Because you've already baked the labels in. This all speaks to the idea that, if only you can keep track of all of the transformations, basically keep track of more metadata, life will be better. Now, I think it's unarguable that surely that's better than not doing it, right? I've never claimed that it will go and solve all of your problems. But just to show you how people can get the wrong end of the stick on this, so this paper, Counterfactual, How Fact Undermines Its Organizing Principles. So FACT is the name of a conference. It's called Fairness, Fairness, Accountability, something or other. I can't remember what it's called. It used to be called FAT, exactly. And I went to FAT. And I thought that was great. Where are you going? I'm going to FAT. Yeah, I won Best Paper Prize at FAT. This is pretty cool. Yeah, I've been the only one changed the name of it. Anyway, so that's the point of the funny title. And, in the interest of trying to be balanced, I think this is largely silly. And that their complaint, so they come up with this fancy word, metadata maximalism, which is simply, this idea that if only you keep more metadata, then, life is good. So I certainly never say that it will fix everything. They make this point here, is motivated by the implicit assumption that a complete contextual history can predict the normative implications of its use in context, therefore warranting a contextual trust. Lots of big words here, but their logic is simply flawed, right? Just because something is good to do, right, or that someone says this is good to do, doesn't mean that they're saying, if you do this, life will be good, right? It just doesn't logically follow, yeah?
I mean, metadata is also just like more data, because let's say we record the date
Yes.
at the data point, and then we don't use it, and somebody else takes the data set and feeds the data as well.
That's right.
Machine learning model is just
No, this is exactly right, and it's interesting. So I don't know what it's like in Europe, but in Australia, maybe 10 years ago, there was a big political kerfuffle about security services, listening in on people's conversations, right? And so the spooks knew perfectly well that if they collected enough, let's call it metadata, right? That, you made 17 phone calls to him over a 2-week period. That's all that they know. They don't actually know the content of it, but they know who spoke to who and when. So that's kind of called metadata. And the argument was that, well, surely it's perfectly fine for them to have access to that. Now, the spooks wanted that. They knew they couldn't get everything, and they knew that this was actually going to be sufficient. But then what happened in the political debate, which was kind of funny, was you would have ministers trying to explain to Parliament the difference between data and metadata, right? And they're just tying themselves in philosophical knots. I mean, because you simply can't, right? I mean, metadata is just another type of data. It's inherently relational, right? And contextual, yep?
What is meant with metadata maximalism?
So that's the name, that's the funny name that they give to this position, that if only you get enough metadata. So the maximalism is, let's just record everything. So in a way, it's one of the things that I've been arguing is a fine thing to do, right? There's not a lot of literature on it. So this is one paper that I found, but I think they've misunderstood the point, right? But anyway, I still think it's worthwhile reading things that are wrong. All right. Now, Charles Darwin had this precept, which I really like, that he would regularly, when he encountered a book or a paper or something, and when his first reaction to it was, this is going to be a useless piece of crap, he would catch himself thinking, maybe I'm wrong. So he'll go and read it anyway. And it's actually a really good thing. I've used this, and in many, many cases, it turns out to be useful. In some cases, it turns out to be a piece of crap. But it's actually a good heuristic to use. So another duality from agnostic to agonistic. Agnostic means, you're hedging whether you believe in God. Agonistic is you like to argue, right? Arguing is like controvertibility. The fact that we can, change positions. This is Maynard Keynes. There's a nice quote. He looks a very intimidating kind of fellow. When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? So it's this idea of the willingness of, changing your mind and arguing the toss about the facts with someone else. And so I'll distinguish two different notions of contestability, things that you can argue about. You can have contestability by data subjects. So this is, people's access to their data, right to be forgotten, and so on. But you've also got the contestability I'm interested in is by the instigators, commissioners, and designers, in contrast to the factiness, doubting and thus contesting all the elements of the chain of reference. So both of these are important, right? So providing the ability of the people about who your data is about, allowing them to contest and correct their records is one thing. We're not going really into that. I'm focusing on, supposing we're well-intentioned, how can we contest the implicit knowledge claims that our systems make. I think I introduced you to some work by Joshua Kroll on scrutability. Thank you. Yes, but he also uses this simpler word, traceability, in his paper outlining traceability, a principle for operationalizing accountability in computing systems. So it's the same idea that I've already mentioned several times, keeping log files and so on. But I think this is one of the more carefully worked through proposals, and it's not the idea in general. He's talking about how you might go about doing this quite specifically, in the kind of automated systems that machine learning people help build. So I've used several different words here, controvertibility and so on. Here's another one, debatability, right? And I mentioned this book to you a few lectures ago by Alain Desrosiers, The Politics of Large Numbers. The last chapter of that book, his conclusion, it's quite short, and if you don't read any of the other documents I provide you for this lecture, I'm saying read this one. It's only 8 pages or so, and he calls it Disputing the Indisputable. And it's important to realize, his job, he worked for a large government statistical agency. I can't remember what it was called, but it's like the French National Statistics Office or something like that. So in charge of collecting all of these government statistics, which have been very consequential. The politicians allocate large sums of money on the basis of these things. So these numbers end up really mattering. And so this is why, the title of his book, right? And, remember, I think I told you, and it's worth keeping in mind that the very word statistics comes from the same root as the word of state, right? Statistics were invented by states so that they could work out how much they could tax people. That's where it comes from. Anyway, so he very admirably, I think, for an insider, a statistician whose day job it is to do this, says how statistical reason has become virtually synonymous with proof, with almost uncontestable standards of reference. He gives examples of how, things like insurance turned chance into stable collective objects. So you take all of this uncertainty in the world, you turn it into a stack of numbers, you do certain calculations on it, you take averages, you calculate these probabilities, and then you say, well, now we've got this thing, right? Previously it looked like chaos, now we know what's going on, and it's kind of certain, and you can't argue with it, because all we did was we just took all of these numbers. I don't think I need to read all of those things, because I'm just pulling out a few quotes from this short paper, and I've encouraged you to go and read that. It's very nicely written. It's not turgid like lots of the other stuff that I've plowed through. And I think you'll find it interesting. You then might want to go and look at the whole book. So I think I've already made the point about history earlier on. People, like you think of big historical events, the French Revolution, people still write books on it, right? It's not like there's the last ever history of the French Revolution. People are going to go back and write a different history on it to try and, get a different perspective. So I think that's really the only point I wanted to make there. This cute title from agnostic to agonistic is not my invention. It was this lady, Muriel Hildebrandt, came up with this in the context of thinking about privacy, privacy concerns arising in machine learning, and she's making a similar point. It's really just different words, but her paper is Privacy as Protection of the Incomputable Self, from agnostic to agonistic machine learning. This is one of the more interesting papers I've found on this thing I'm banging on about today. I think she's like a social scientist. She's not a technical person, so she's got the outsider's perspective. Obviously I'm leaning a lot on outsider's perspective because the machine learners don't see this, right? So that's it. It can be difficult for us, engineers or computer scientists to read the outsider's perspective, but it's kind of healthy for us to do so. This point about arguing about everything, so if I come back to the original analogy I made at the beginning of the lecture, that machine learning is science continued by other means. One view of science is that it's certain knowledge. So there's this nice distinction that Ludwig Fleck made between textbook science and journal science. So what he means by that is if something ends up in a textbook, right, it's usually pretty old. It's been around for a long, long time. And it would be astonishing if it's wrong. It still can be, but it's kind of rock solid. And if you think of the kind of science that kids learn in schools, it's like that, right? I mean, and consequently, scientists can then go and, I think, erroneously claim more certainty for their scientific knowledge, right? They think that they've actually figured out the truth. Now, when you start doing science yourself, so some of you end up, you know, having a research career and you start doing science, psychologically, one of the hardest things to deal with is you realize that the science that you do is nothing like that. It's dripping in uncertainty, right? You're feeling the uncertainty yourself. So this observation was made long ago by Fleck, and how does science with a capital S deal with this? People argue about it. You know, you publish a paper. There's all sorts of errors and uncertainties. So someone else publishes a paper saying that can't be right. We get different results. Someone else says, well, the problem is you're using the wrong technique to measure, right? It can get, you know, really agitated. And if you don't understand how this works, right, and you're some crazy right-wing politician, you go and start reading the scientific literature, you say, well, look, the scientists can't agree, therefore they don't know anything, therefore we don't have to listen to them, right? And it's just bad logic, right? It is true that they don't agree. They do know something, that it is worth listening to them. Actually, just as an aside about the psychology of this, so, you know, Isaac Newton is considered by most people as one of the most famous or best scientists ever lived. So how many scientific papers do you reckon Newton published?
Like the concept of a paper exists?
Yes, it did. It
Okay.
did. Yeah.
Say 4?
One. He published one paper, which this is the title of it, A Letter of Mr. Isaac Newton containing his new theory about light and colours. So he published that, and then people started sniping at it, saying, well, this can't be right. And he got so pissed off with the criticism. I mean, he was a really difficult guy. He said, fine, I won't publish papers anymore. So he didn't publish anything for a long time. His big theory of light and colours, I think it took him 30 years before he published his book on it, right? He basically just published a couple of books, and that's what he's famous for. But it's kind of funny that, you know, you think of him as a scientific hero, right? You know, it's like the beginning PhD student. They get some bad reviews. They go crying to their supervisor. You know, Isaac didn't have anyone to talk to because he didn't have any friends because he was such an asshole. And so his reaction is, no, he was an asshole. You read his biography, he's a really unpleasant person. Anyway, so this is what he concluded. The bitter experience of controversy taught him that journal publication meant entry into an agonistic forum. He didn't want to have to argue. He knew he was right, and so why bother wasting his time with all of these doofuses? That was his logic. And, you know, nowadays you've probably come across this big anxiety of, you know, the crisis of reproducibility in science. It's often couched in an extremely narrow-minded way where people just anguish about the use of p-values and so on. But it's kind of completely missing the point, right? I mean, if you say, oh, look, you know, this study was published that claimed blah, and then another study was published and it didn't agree with it, it's terrible, right? Whereas if you say, we don't know anything about the world, we think this might be the case, and we'll expose it to criticism. Someone else comes along and says, no, actually for us it's somehow different. Life is good. It just depends upon how you look at it. So I think, you know, there's so much written about, oh, you know, science is in a crisis because of lack of reproducibility. You know, it's really quite funny. I didn't mention it on the slides, but there's a famous paper, half of all published scientific findings are false. Has anyone heard of that? You can easily find it. Here's the great thing. most of the claims that he makes in that paper are false. So the title of the paper should have been half of all scientific papers, including this one, are false. Anyway. So several, it's easy to find famous scientists who get this. John Wheeler, our whole problem is to make the mistakes as fast as possible. His very famous PhD student, Richard Feynman, made a big deal about this. And this is another really short piece that I'd encourage you to read. I think it was like a graduation address somewhere. So it's called Cargo Cult Science. And it's at one level nothing to do with machine learning, but it's essentially just about intellectual integrity. And you read a biography of Feynman, and he was, I think it's fair to say that he was motivated to give this talk because he'd had the experience of, he went down to give lectures in Brazil. He wanted to hang out in Rio de Janeiro because it was a cool place, so he accepted this invitation to go to Brazil. And the students there who were trying to learn physics, they were approaching it just as pure book knowledge. They didn't realize that it was connected to the world, but they were just kind of going through the motions, right? It's like, if you see this, then you do that without understanding it. So his point was they're not being honest with themselves. They're not trying to connect what the texts say with what's going on out there. Anyway, I think that's the last word I've got on this particular topic. But yes, this is just good for your academic soul, right? There's nothing particularly to do with machine learning.
Everyone is trying to get to the bar. Name of the bar. The bar is called Heaven. The band in heaven, they play my favorite song. Play it one more time. Play it all night long. Oh, heaven, heaven is the place, a place where nothing ever happens. Heaven is a place, a place where nothing ever happens. There is a party, everyone is there. Everyone will leave at exactly the same time. When this party's over, it will start again. Will not be any different. Will be exactly the same. Oh, heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. When this kiss is over, it will start again. Will not be any different. Will be exactly the same. It's hard to imagine that nothing other could be so exciting, could be this much fun. Oh, heaven is a place where nothing, nothing ever happened. Heaven, heaven is a place where nothing, nothing ever
Okay, final stretch. Sun's going down. At this place on the next day, 10 years ago, I saw a green flash. Anyone ever heard of the green flash? Oh, so exciting. I actually saw it. It's very rare. You need very good conditions. And then just as I got the green flash, 2 dolphins jumped out of the water. It's like, I should have had my camera that day. All right. So we finally get to this topic of rhetoric, from report to rhetoric. And I'm going to talk about the rhetorical style of machine learning, which it sounds a little, I don't know, oxymoronic or something or other, but let's see what I have to say. So let's think, what are we trying to achieve with our machine learning systems? At a general level, we could say the inference of some knowledge from data. That should be from data. But how do we argue for our results? So it's one thing to go and say, I did this and here's the answer. But, you've got to persuade your audience. But what do we effectively do? We just report them. So this is my point. This is the duality from report to rhetoric. So think of the distinction between I analyze the data, this is the result, to something that says, and here's my argument why. So that's the idea that I want to develop now. The usual implicit argument is, crudely put, the data is certain, our method is great, you can rely upon the conclusions. I mean, normally no one would say it so bluntly, but I think that's the essence of it. And there's no or very little explicit argumentation or rhetoric to support our claim. It's taken for granted that we're just objectively, building this model. We've got clever mathematicians. This is what we've concluded. So we've seen diagrams like this already, I think in the previous lecture, where, we've got the overall context that we are working within. We've got our magic machine learning box. It ingests data and it produces some output at some abstract level. And the data, of course, comes from the world and our output interferes with the world in some way. And the question I'm asking are, what are the warrants? So using the word warrant in this fashion is something that's used in rhetoric. It's the perfect word for it. It's the warrant is the basis on which the argument holds, right? So we're drawing the distinction between this is what we do and this is why what we do is good, right? So having those two levels is very helpful. So, here we might want to warrant that the data accurately reflects the world. It's not just some random convenience sample. We did a proper randomized design. We took great care, right? There's a big difference if you've got data with a warrant like that versus just some convenient sample that you had. We might have a warrant that the ML method does what it claims, if it actually makes a claim. So here, many of the, fancy machine learning methods, people can't even say what it is that it does. It's just an algorithm. Like with simple ones, you can do it, right? So, with linear regression or something rather, you can state in a functional way what it is that it's trying to do. With squared loss, we're trying to calculate the conditional expectation of y given x, right? For more complicated models, it's not so clear, right? With all of the knobs, the model classes, the regularizers, the different optimizers, who knows what it is trying to do? And then, the output, you would analogously have warrants that the effects are indeed as desired. Just because you can predict accurately doesn't mean that the world will follow your predictions. Problems of performativity and so on. So as I said, this notion of a warrant is, it's not new, it's kind of traditional in the theory of rhetoric. There's this nice example in the book by Stephen Tuleman. He's got here, this a bit small perhaps on the screen, but his the example is, Harry was born in Bermuda, so presumably Harry is a British subject. So this is just a claim, it's all totally in words, but then the warrant is all of this stuff that sits beneath it. And of course, you can keep going down, right? I mean, there's kind of no end to this. The single interesting idea here is just drawing the distinction between the claim and the justification of the claim. In the literature on rhetoric, they they do use these words in a careful kind of way. So when they talk about data, the data is the starting point of your claim, right? So it's the beginning. The conclusion is the end point. The argument is the basic claim, and the warrant is a certification of the legitimacy of the claim. Okay, so that's a pretty simple idea, and so you can apply that to machine learning. As I said, you've got data, the ML box is kind of the argument, and then you've got the conclusion. Yep?
Is there a difference between a warrant and a premise?
No. Sorry, yes. Yes, I think so. I mean, look, I'm not an expert in the theory of rhetoric. I'm stealing this idea to try and understand how it's useful in machine learning. To me, those two words would mean a different thing, right? A premise is like a presumption, I guess. But I don't know. You could put one inside the other, right? Set containment. But I don't think that. I think there's a subtlety there, but we don't need it. Okay. So the usual form of these kinds of arguments that we work with is that the data is explicit, but the warrants are implicit. I think that's kind of obvious. I mean, oftentimes, I just did it myself, right? I said it's kind of obvious. The warrant, the argument is left implicit. And the single constructive thing that I'm drawing from trying to think of machine learning in this rhetorical way is that it would, I think, be helpful to try and make your warrants more explicit, right? Try and actually spell out the basis of, it's not just that we've used this fancy model. Here's the argument as to why using that model in this case is legitimate. It's not just that we've got this data. Here's the warrant that the data is legitimate, and you have to keep track of all of these things and provide them downstream. When I first encountered this whole literature on rhetoric, my first reaction to this was it's the last thing that you want to think about for the sake of machine learning, because surely rhetoric is just spin doctoring, right? Or just advertising. I was persuaded otherwise, by reading this literature, in particular about scientific arguments, right? So the fact that there is a rhetoric of science is not a new idea. And so you can see, this is from a book, The Politics and Rhetoric of Scientific Method. They say scientific argument is essentially persuasive argument, and therefore is rightly termed rhetorical in the sense defined by students of the new rhetoric, where rhetoric denotes the entire field of discursive structures and strategies. So when they say the new rhetoric, they're alluding to this book. This was I gather, a revolutionary book. It was published in the mid-60s originally, and rhetoric's been around forever. Since Aristotle, it used to be one of the main subjects in the medieval university curriculum. And these guys, Chaim Perelman and Lucy Albrecht-Teitika, they kind of completely reinvigorated it and made it clear that actually we're using this all of the time. And they do explicitly talk about science, and it's interesting, and this was illuminating to me. They don't disdain science or reason, but only self-evident reason. So the thing that they're targeting is this notion that, well, I've used this method, it's somehow certified by someone else. I don't have to give you the proof, right? It's kind of like just giving the claim. It's like saying, look, I worked out this theorem, here's the theorem, but just trust me, I'm not going to give you the proof. In lots of areas of science, we do demand the proof, right? If you go and think of the classic experimental science paper, they have the experimental section, they tell you in, minute detail what they've done. What are they doing when they're doing that? They're giving you the argument, right? So I think, my organising principle for the lecture is to look at the way science makes itself better and see, can we steal some of those ideas for machine learning? So give, a few other quotes there that you can read. One of the interesting ideas, so this was new to me, and I think it's interesting to ask what this means for machine learning. They introduce as an essential feature the idea of the audience. So it's all very well to say that you want to persuade, but it begs the question, well, who is it that you're wanting to persuade? And in some cases, it's kind of clear, right? It's this person or it's this group, and sometimes it's not. And so they invented this notion of a universal audience. It's kind of like an abstract, reasonable kind of person. But I guess the point is that depending upon who you're trying to persuade, you might provide different sorts of arguments, right? If you're talking to a fellow mathematician, you can go and give the full mathematical proof. If you're talking to a lawyer, you'll have to do some translation, right? Again, remember what I'm trying to do is to give you different ways of thinking about the problems that we have with our machine learning systems. I entitled this little section of the lecture From Report to Rhetoric. Maybe I probably stole the idea from here. The authors of scientific reports and similar papers often think that if they merely report certain experiments, mention certain facts, or enunciate a certain number of truths, this is enough of itself to automatically arouse the interest of the hearers or readers. They say that this attitude rests on the illusion that the facts speak for themselves. It's not hard at all to find in the machine learning literature people saying, look, this is not the old kind of science, it's data-driven, right? We want to let the data speak for itself, right? You Google that phrase, you will find lots of papers on that. It's an appealing idea, right? That, we just pay attention to what the data says, but I think it's interesting to compare that mindset, right? That positivist mindset that just says the data is somehow correct, and so if we just listen to it, all will be good, with this, the point that these guys are making. Being argumentative, some people will say it's kind of annoying. In the big five personality inventory, one of the 5 dimensions is agreeableness, right? And, normally people think that being agreeable is better than being disagreeable, as a general rule. So it's interesting, there's a fascinating book by this lady, Charlene Nemeth. She's a professor, I guess, of psychology at Berkeley, and she published this book. For some reason, this is an interesting aside. In Australia and the UK, her book has got this title, and in the US, it's called this. I don't know what that says about the two cultures. I don't know. I have this one. I saw this and I thought, this is a great title, right? And, you see the fish swimming up, seeing the power of dissent in life and business, whereas this one is the power of disagreement in a world that just wants to get along. She's assembled a whole stack of empirical evidence, like not just observational, but doing experiments. For example, you get a group of people together that have to solve some joint problem. You have 2 different, priming effects, primings that you do to them. One of them you say, look, you've got to reach consensus, just, get along. And the other one, you encourage them to disagree and have big arguments. And then you have a third party judge the quality of the solutions that they come up with. And punchline is that the groups that had decent arguments ended up with better solutions, right? I mean, the point is, disagreeing is good, is the bottom line. So anyway, this is no mention of machine learning there, but it's, I think it's, well, it's a fun read. If you like to disagree with people and like to have evidence in your pocket that it's good to disagree, then you can quote this book. You know, so if you get a family lunch and they say, "Why are you so disagreeable?" you say, "Well, there's a Berkeley professor that says that it's a good thing to do." They'll love you.
Professor or the family?
Yeah. Yeah, so just the phrase scientific rhetoric, when you first, well, certainly when I first encountered it, I thought it's an oxymoron. I mean, this is, you know, self-contradictory. And so I've just assembled a few interesting quotes here about, you know, people who've tried to step back and as objectively as possible look at the way science progresses. So I'll show you some of these. One peculiar aspect of the accomplishment of scientific discourse is that it appears to hide itself, yet to write science is commonly thought not to write at all, just simply to record the natural facts. The point of the first one is that there is a rhetoric to the scientific paper, but you try and hide it. I think I've got one later on that talks about the rhetoric of anti-rhetoric. A very fun paper to read is this one here, The Rhetoric of Science, Authority and Duty in an Article from the Exact Sciences. This is by Bruno Latour. So he found a nice short scientific paper. It's like an experimental work. It's only 7 or 8 pages long. And then he did an analysis of it, right? Looking at all of the rhetorical tricks that they're using. And if I recall correctly, when the authors found that they'd done this, because they published this rhetorical analysis, they were really pissed off with it. Because, you know, their view was that, no, we're telling the truth here. Whereas the outsider can go and say, no, you think you're telling the truth, right? You're going through all of this posturing, but this is what you're actually trying to say. So I think that's illuminating. And, you know, I guess one of the reasons I wanted to point you to that is that, you know, you could imagine doing a similar exercise. Here's my machine learning system. Here's what it's based upon. We're using it to make all of these decisions. You know, have an outsider come in and look at it in this critical way, I think is interesting. Yes, so the traditional view is what's called anti-rhetoric. It's the rhetoric of anti-rhetoric. So this comes up both in science and in the law. And, you know, this book, The Rhetoric of Rhetoric, talks about that. It says it's now quite widespread. Yes, the law, it likes to view itself as denying rhetoric. The particular rhetoric embraced by the law operates through the systematic denial that it is rhetoric. It's funny, like I seem to be going on about this, but it's one of these things, once you start looking at the world through this rhetorical lens, you can see stuff that's just invisible otherwise. So that's why I think it's kind of interesting. And you could even, so there's this paper here, Information Infrastructure as Rhetoric, which is, you know, taking it an even step further. So information infrastructure includes all sorts of things like libraries, taxonomies, catalogs, and so on. And, you know, it shouldn't be a surprise to you. You remember what I've told you in the past about where the categories come from, right? You can think of categories as infrastructure. One of the papers I talked about, I think last week, viewed data sets as infrastructure. So, and, you know, the common view of infrastructure is something that's particularly solid and hard to change. You know, if you want to go and change the plumbing in this building, it's buried in the concrete, all right? So infrastructure gets solidified. Anyway, so there's, you know, several, you know, different pointers to, you know, using the rhetorical lens to critically look at, you know, how science works, how the law works, and by implication, how machine learning works. There's an interesting shortish paper, The Concept of Scientific Fact, Perelman and Beyond. So Perelman was Chaim Perelman, the author of the new rhetoric, and they made this point, and I learned a new word here, which I think is worth mentioning. It's a classic word. So if you look at a classic book on rhetoric, there's this giant list of all of these arcane terms, like different kinds of arguments. I'm only mentioning exactly one of them, this thing called an enthymeme. And that's yes, a funny word. It's an argument in which one premise is not explicitly stated, right? So you asked about premises before. So for example, let's think of the simplest example with machine learning, right? We have our data, we build our model, here is the conclusion. The implicit premise is that the data is representative of the world, right? You know, that the data was, you know, properly randomly sampled rather than being a convenient sample. You go and look at, you know, pick a random machine learning paper, you'll see this pattern. This paper that I pointed you to, The Concept of Scientific Fact, the author of that, her claim was that most scientific papers do this. So there's a whole stack of stuff that you just take for granted, so then you can move on. So I'm not saying that that's intrinsically and inevitably bad, right? You can't go rehearsing everything and going back, but you should at least be aware of what you're doing. Now, the funny thing historically is you say, well, why is it like this? Because it was mandated. So in the so someone here asked about Newton. Were there even the idea of a scientific paper then? So where the scientific paper came from is now well understood. So it arose from the Royal Society. Originally Henry Oldenburg, who was the Foreign Secretary of the Royal Society, he would just shuffle letters between scientists, right? So that they could share their discoveries. Eventually this became too much for one person, and so effectively they invented the idea of the scientific paper. They started publishing the Proceedings of the Royal Society, I think in 1666, and they then started formalizing it all, right? So, you know, you start, you know, as organizations get older, you know, it's a cold night, not much going on. What are you going to do? You're going to make up some rules, right? You know, it makes your society feel stronger. So this book, I looked at Rhetoric in the Early Royal Society, quoted from Chapter 5, Article 4 of the Royal Society Statutes of 1728. So they started publishing 1666, 1728 is what, 60 years afterwards. They're starting to spell out what a scientific paper is. If you look at the first, like it's all online, right, freely available, you can look at the first issue of the Proceedings of the Royal Society, 1666 or 1667, and it's funny, actually, you know. Someone writes in, I found this weird dead sheep. No, literally, right? There's you know, it had two heads or something or other. And it's just strange anomalies like that. And there's no theory or anything. You know, it's just like, I'd like to report I found this weird dead sheep, right? So they're starting to get their act together. And anyway, look at their rule. I mean, all reports of experiments to be brought into the society, the matter of fact shall be barely stated without prefaces, apologies, or rhetorical flourishes, and entered into the register book. They were saying, you know, we don't want any of this fancy, you know, storytelling. We just want the facts, right? You know, that you found another interesting dead sheep. And it's now entirely codified. So this last paper, I quote, the form of the experimental paper, a realization of the myth of induction, right? This evolved over a long period of time. It's not like this was somehow God-given. Like the scientific paper could be different, right? And if you go and look at papers in other disciplines, they are different. But in the experimental sciences, there's this rigid way of doing things, which overall is very good, but it has some downsides, right? Just like with machine learning. So I think there's an interesting analogy. Remember, I'm just making this analogy of how science works, how science evolved, and we think about what that implies about machine learning. So the rhetoric of science sounds odd, but quite a few people have taken this rhetorical notion and run with it. You can talk about the rhetoric of statistics or economics. This is Deirdre McCloskey. She was originally Donald, but at this point she's Deirdre McCloskey, and she makes the bold claim statistics is rhetorical. That is to say, it depends on a conversation, an agreement about human beings about what they're going to take seriously. It's not immanent in nature. And there's a few other pointers I've got there. For example, with accounting, I've made reference to accounting before. Accountants is another group of nerdy people that, muck around with numbers in spreadsheets like machine learning people do. And there's some nice literature on this, rhetoric and the invention of double entry bookkeeping. The way that the accounts of every corporation in the Western world are now done, this idea of double entry bookkeeping, there's a history to that. It's a storytelling thing, and it allows you to sort of judge the quality of the accounts entirely internally. So it's a way of, we don't have to look at the world anymore. As long as the two entries balance, we draw the conclusion that everything is good, right? Because what the double entry method does guarantee is that there's no easy embezzlement, right? You can't go taking money out of one ledger if it doesn't appear on the other one. And if your controls are set up appropriately, it's a pretty good proxy for checking that things are going well. Anyway, my point is, I'm just showing other examples of taking this rhetorical mindset and looking at things that seem the antithesis of rhetoric, right? I mean, accounting seems like the most mundane, mechanical, facty sort of thing, but when you come and look at it from an outsider, you draw different conclusions. Other philosophers of science, Mary Hess, developed this idea of science being a network of facts and theories. So she was distinguishing between it's this kind of linear process, but rather it's this kind of big spider's web that it's holding it all together. And there's other examples like this. Latour talks about chains of reference, but he should really have said networks. We met previously Sabine Leonelli's data journeys. So you imagine this, long convoluted journey of your data. So once you start looking, this took me a long time, but once you look at things in this different way, you realize actually many folks have been sniffing out this idea, and I don't think it's as radical as it might seem. All right, so that's all on rhetoric, and so I will bat to conclude, and the way I want to conclude is to try and distill as succinctly as I can some of the conclusions. This is not being a course where I've gone and derived, theorems or something or other and said this must be the way of doing things, but I've tried to reduce here in 3 or 4 slides, some takeaway precepts that I think might be helpful. And I'm calling it this funny name for a reason that I'll explain. So in a sec. So as a final say by our friend Bruno Latour, as a warm-up, the world is not a solid continent of facts sprinkled by a few lakes of uncertainties, but a vast ocean of uncertainties speckled by a few islands of stabilized forms. Do we really know that little? We know even less. So he's often portrayed as someone who's anti-science and criticizes how science works. If you read about him, he actually wanted to be a scientist, and he was very excited in talking to scientists. He's just, I think, honestly skeptical about the claims. He's not just assuming that you finally got to the truth, and that's the kind of the thought that I want to channel towards the end here. So, who's Mnemosyne? Who's heard of Mnemosyne before? You didn't study Greek mythology? What's university education these days? So she was the daughter of Uranus and Gaia. So she was a Titan. So in their mythology, there's gods and there's Titans. Titans are higher rank, and one of the accounts. So this is a Greek historian 2,000 years ago. He says that Mnemosyne discovered the uses of the power of reason and she gave a designation to every object about us by means of the names which were used to express whatever we could and to hold conversation with one another. And to this goddess is also attributed the power to call things to memory and to remembrance. So she's, in their mythology, responsible for the power of reason, giving objects names, recording them, and remembering them. She's a data scientist, right? So, I think if machine learning needs its own goddess, and so I reckon Mnemosyne is the goddess of machine learning. Right? I mean, give me a counter goddess. I can't think of a better one. So, what do I have her say to you? Since we are never certain about anything, record as much as possible to allow you to go back and revise your conclusions. Simple. Since our ethical stances will usually differ, remember the notion of an essentially contested concept, declare them up front so others can understand where you're coming from. This was the premise of the paper I talked to you about with the Singapore government. Since data is fraught as a representation of the world, record the warrants that you've got justifying your use of the data. Don't just take the data as a given, provide the warrant for it. It might allow someone else to do some forensics later on. Since the harms of the system that you build will depend upon the use to which it will be put, declare that up front and provide an argument as to your choice of evaluation. If you're building a system to do this, these are the harms, here's how we're going to mitigate the harms. This speaks to the idea that, it's the use of the technology rather than the technology itself. Since ex post explanations don't really help, declare your goals and your warrants about your methods ex ante. So that simple distinction between ex post and ex ante, I think, is very helpful. We learned today, since most machine learning methods are not amenable to such warrants, develop and use those that are instead. A different point, right? So rather than saying, here's my machine learning method, I can't give you an ex ante warrant for it. I can't give you a theory for it. All I can do is use it and then look at the result. So this is current practice. Here, I'll use my deep neural network, and then I'll try and patch onto that even more complications with explainable AI. Alternatively, you could go back to the drawing board and say, well, what we want here is we don't want an explanation. We want a warrant ex ante before we do anything that this thing will work. That may well lead us to designing different systems. Maybe we won't obsess so much about the exact performance. We'll be happy with 92% accuracy instead of 93%, but at least we'll be able to understand what's going on. Since protected attributes, remember from the very beginning of the course about fairness, these correspond to social groups which are themselves contingent, fraught, and contestable, record your logic for privileging those you choose. You will very rarely see in any of the literature I've looked at in fair machine learning, people will say, well, we worry about, whether it's race or sex or whatever, right? But they don't give the argument as to why, right? And that's clearly has to be context dependent. And again, I think surely it's better if you declare your hand, recognizing that people may well disagree with you. Something we met in the very beginning of the course, since there are sometimes unavoidable trade-offs between utility and fairness, at the very least you should find the Pareto frontier and explain your choice of point on it. So the notion of a Pareto frontier, parameterizing a trade-off, I think is one of the extremely useful tool in the engineer's toolkit. And most things are a trade-off. Lots of non-engineers don't like this perspective. I think I related the story about the philosophers who claimed that if you have a trade-off, that just means you've set the problem up incorrectly. And I think that's completely misguided, right? You always have trade-offs. Since overly used words such as fairness, bias, privacy, transparency are so multifaceted and indeed contestable, just don't use them. This is actually an extremely useful heuristic, and I think I've mentioned it to some of you in the individual conversations I've had about your essay. where you're saying, oh well, we're worried about transparency, say. Now transparency, okay, fine, the window's transparent. I know what it means, kind of, but in context, it can have so much baggage, and then you end up going down this rabbit hole of saying, oh well, we just have to go and define it. A better heuristic is to say, let's try and state our problem without using the word. I found this remarkably powerful thinking trick. Since the context in which your technological efforts are conducted have a great effect on the outcome, pay great attention to it. Right? So the whole lecture last week was, paying attention to the context. The fish doesn't notice the water that it's swimming in. You have to actually deliberately look. Since the effects of your ML system are consequences of the whole system, not just the individual parts, you thus need to evaluate the system end to end, even if it's constructed in modules, as is almost universal. So you've got this tension here. Like, to build any big system, you have to go and do it in modules. Separation of concerns, farm the work out. But in the end, it's the whole system, right? It could be that it's only because your data's dodgy that the system doesn't work. Or maybe the data's great and it's this intermediate part. Lots of things can go wrong, but the harm is a consequence of the whole system. Since the harms mediated or caused by ML systems hurt individuals ultimately, I can't conceive... It's a real stretch, I think, to talk about harming a group in a manner that's not merely harming all the members in the group. People have tied themselves in knots trying to get to that point. I think I talked about this, the individual versus the aggregate, but the conclusion I draw from this is that therefore don't just think in terms of aggregates. Now this is easier said than done. So I know some of you are grappling with this for your, I can't remember which group is grappling with this for their second assignment, but all I'm suggesting here is don't think solely in terms of the aggregates, right? I'm not expecting some magical solution to this aggregate individual problem anytime soon, but at least keeping track in our mind that, like our fairness concerns are typically stated as an aggregate thing, but then what we're worried about avoiding is a harm to an individual. So we've always got that dissonance, and it's intrinsically tricky. And since the easiest person to fool is yourself, act with humility and be less certain of yourself. So this is Richard Feynman's advice. So that was my attempt to make some takeaways that I'm hoping will be fruitful long-term for the future. So what did we see today? We looked at a stack of different dualities. I organised it solely in terms of these dualities, from thing to process, stability to lability, forwards to reverse, agnostic to agonistic, report to rhetoric, and then we saw Nemesini's web of guesses. So I've explained Nemesini. Where's the web of guesses come from? So this is the final part of the lecture. Going back even further than I've managed so far in the course, Xenophanes was a Greek philosopher from about 2,500 years ago, prior to Plato. He's one of the famous pre-Socratics. And Karl Popper, one of the most famous philosophers of the 20th century, he could read Greek, good for him. So he translated a poem of Xenophanes. He was very excited about this, and he included it in several of his books, this poem. And I think it's wonderful. And since I wanted to, it's hard to finish a whole course. You've got to find something memorable. So I just wanted to show you this poem and read it out to you, and then we're done. And I think it's very nice. But as for certain truth, no man has known it, nor will he know it, neither of the gods, nor yet of all the things of which I speak. And even if by chance he were to utter the perfect truth, he would himself not know it, for all is but a woven web of guesses. Okay?
You must leave now, take what you need, you think will last. But whatever you wish to keep, you better grab it fast. his gun, crying like a fire in the sun. Look at all the saints are coming through, and it's all over now, baby blue. The highway yields for gamblers, better use your sense. Take what you have gathered from coincidence. The empty-handed hater from your street is drawing crazy patterns on your sheets. The sky too is folding over you, and it's all over now, baby blue. Sailors, they are rowing home. All your reindeer armies, they are going home. The lover who just walked out your door has taken all his blankets from the floor. The carpet too is moving on, and it's all over now, baby blue. Leave your stepping stones behind, something calls for you. Forget the dead you've left, they will not follow you. The vagabond who's rapping at your door is standing in the clothes that you once wore. Strike another match, go start anew, and it's all over now, baby blue. And it's all over